Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea is going to keep administering the coronavirus vaccine developed by AstraZeneca. A panel of experts advising the government that the benefits outweigh the risks. President Moon's urging people to get the shot when it's their turn. Data show South Korean households tightened their budgets last year and ended each month on average with 30% of their income left over, the highest surplus on record. And South Korea's exports so far this month are up 12.5% from a year ago, led by shipments of semiconductors and cars. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korean households tightened their budgets by an historic amount last year. On average, they had 30% of their incomes left over at the end of each month. Not only were they padding their rainy day funds just in case, the virus restrictions meant consumers had fewer opportunities to spend anyway. Kim Sung-min reports.
Due to the pandemic, South Korean households spent far less of their income than any other year in recorded history in 2020. This is according to reports released by Statistics Korea. The budget surplus rate, which is the amount left out of a household's disposable income after expenses, was over 30% for all 4 quarters of last year. There has only been one other quarter in recorded history that the figure was above 30%. A high surplus occurs when income increases overall or consumption tightens. Last year's figure can be attributed more to the latter as the economy was slammed by the pandemic. Consumer confidence was weak and people closed their wallets. However, at the same time, overall income did not take much of a hit, especially with the government stimulus measures leading to the large budget surplus.
Small businesses and in-person services were hit hard, but that wasn't necessarily the case for other areas. That plus the reduced consumption led to the higher surplus.
Such a phenomenon was apparent during the first quarter of last year, which posted the largest budget surplus out of all 4 quarters. While the average household's monthly income was up 3.7% to around $4,700, spending decreased almost 5% to some $3,500. This was the pattern for the other 3 quarters, although there were some slight differences. And the trend is also likely to continue in the following quarters.
The situation is still not conducive for consumption due to difficulties in using in-person services. But at the same time, economic growth of around 3% is projected, so this year is likely to see similar figures as last year.
Some experts say that the suppressed desire for consumption could eventually turn into what they describe as revenge spending, leading to a surge in consumption when the economy finally rebounds. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
South Korea's exports in the first 20 days of March jumped by 12.5% from a year earlier, thanks to strong demand for memory chips and cars. The Korea Customs Service says exports came to $33.9 billion. By sector, semiconductors were up almost 14%, followed closely by cars and petroleum products. Imports rose by more than 16% on year to $33 billion, resulting in an overall trade surplus for the period of $820 million. Now, our Seol Kyung has a few more stories on the economy as we start the week. The Bank of Korea will be releasing data on producer prices, which have been rising. Statistics Korea has new demographic data, and with volatility in the markets, decisions coming up on interest rates by the central banks of Thailand and the Philippines.
On Wednesday, the Bank of Korea will release the Producer Price Index for February this year. The index, which is a barometer of future consumer inflation, rose for 3 consecutive months in January, with the figure increasing 0.9% compared to the previous month. A sharp price increase in agricultural, forestry, and fishery products was the main cause of the rise. Prices jumped almost 8%, showing the largest increase in 2 years and 5 months. A rise in manufacturing goods due to strong international oil prices was also a factor. With prices of oil, raw materials, and grain continuing to rise, all eyes are on whether the Producer Price Index for February will increase for the 4th month. On the same day, Statistics Korea will announce the country's population data for January this year. Last year, the country reported the first natural population decline, meaning the total number of deaths surpassed that of birth. The number of expected babies per South Korean woman during her lifetime fell to 0.84 last year, down from its previous record low of 0.92 the year before. According to the annual report by the UN Population Fund last June, the fertility rate in South Korea was the lowest among 201 surveyed countries. In the Southeast Asian region, the Bank of Thailand will set its interest rates on Wednesday. Last year, the country cut rates 3 times to support its economy. The central bank lowered its benchmark interest rates to 0.5% in May and has kept the record low rate since then. The next announcement will take place in May. On Thursday, the Central Bank of Philippines is set to announce its interest rates. In 2020, it lowers the rate 5 times. The figure went down from 2.25% in June to 2% last November. The Philippine Central Governor said last December that he wanted to keep interest rates low through the end of 2022. 서은경, 아리랑 뉴스.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Monday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, hope you had a good weekend. Thank you for coming on.
Happy to be here.
Well, last Friday, the Fed decided to let a measure it put in place early in the pandemic expire. They had been giving banks more flexibility to lend by lowering the ratio of assets they have to hold against the money they lend. So that ratio will be going up, should be next week. Tell us about that and what significance do you expect it to have?
Okay, well, this is called the supplementary leverage ratio, and we should talk a little bit about what it is. After the 2008 global financial crisis, the Fed wanted to enforce stronger capital ratio on banks. So in addition to other requirements that the banks had already, the Fed imposed 3% capital ratio for most banks and 5% capital ratio for systematically important banks. To satisfy this ratio, the banks had to hold a certain amount of cash or deposits at the Fed, 3% or 5% of their total assets. Now, at the beginning of the coronavirus in March 2020, the coronavirus vastly increased the risk of loans. The banks had to lower the book value of these loans, and as a consequence, it had a higher leverage ratio, and they needed increase in cash, basically. So they had a massive sell-off of Treasury bonds. Even though Treasury bonds are considered very safe investment, it did not satisfy the conditions of the supplementary leverage ratio. So it caused a havoc in the Treasury market. So what the Fed said was that the banks could deduct Treasury bonds and excess reserves as assets, which means banks need less capital to hold and satisfy this SLR requirement. But this exemption runs out at the end of March. So from the end of March, the banks may find Treasury bonds less attractive to hold. Now, this causes a few problems. One, because it has a higher leverage ratio, higher capital ratio that it has to hold on to because they need to have more capital now, they may reduce the loans that the banks make, which can cause hardships for people who want to borrow the money, which may include individuals and companies, but also banks itself, because if they don't lend as much, they don't get as much profit. And then there is a potential problem in the future as the U.S. government is putting forth massive fiscal policy to combat the coronavirus and perhaps invest in infrastructure. That means they have to issue a lot of Treasury bonds. Now, if the banks do not find the Treasury bond as an attractive investment attractive investment, the government may have trouble selling off all these bonds. That may cause another problem in the bond market and the financial market as well. So there are a lot of questions about what the non-extension of this SLR requirement will have, but the Fed is keeping the door open, so to speak, because the banks, the Fed has said that they will examine perhaps an alternative version of this SLR rule so that the banks may not get affected by this SL rule as much in the future.
We'll have to watch the upcoming auction of treasuries in the next few days. And now stocks in New York ended mixed last Friday as treasury rates went back up. The Nasdaq posted a gain for the day, but was still down for the week. Tell us about the global markets and what you see coming in the week ahead.
Okay, well, the U.S. stocks, the Dow, S&P, and Nasdaq all fell on Wednesday and Thursday. And with the exception of Nasdaq, which rose on Friday, the other two indices fell as well. Part of the reason is the continuing fear of inflation and higher 10-year Treasury bond prices, and the non-extension of the SLR rule did not help because that may cause further price drops in the Treasury bond prices, which can result in higher interest rate, which, along with the fear of inflation, can drive the 10-year Treasury bond yields even higher. Now, the European stocks, FTSE, CAC, and Euro 50, it went up until last Thursday. DAX continued to rise, but all of these European stock markets fell on Friday. That's attributed to fear of inflation, problems with vaccination in Europe, and sharp drop in oil prices on Thursday. Asia had very different results for each country in the last few days. Bank of Korea, Bank of China, both had their monetary policy meetings, both held their rates steady, but the Bank of Japan on Friday widened the band in which it allows long-term interest rates to fluctuate around its target from plus minus 2% to plus minus 2.5% to make its easy monetary policy more sustainable. And they also promised not to buy exchange-traded funds except in emergencies, which may account for a large drop in the Nikkei index on Thursday and today. Shanghai fell Friday but rose today. Hang Seng fell Friday, and it's mostly level today.
And today, Korean stocks were up and down during the session, but ended mixed. The Kospi slightly lower and a modest gain on the Kosdaq. Tell us about the local markets.
Okay, well, the local market seems to be in a sort of let's watch and see mood, partially because of the SLR rule in New York, and basically everybody is waiting to see how the market goes. Kospi fell by 0.13% to 3,035.46. Kosdaq rose by 0.34% to 955.38. For both markets, foreigners sold a fairly large amount. Foreigners sold 546 billion won worth of stock in Kospi and $104 billion worth of stocks on Kosdaq. Individuals bought on both of those exchanges.
And we saw today that Korea's exports are up again this month, in large part on memory chips. Our viewers may have seen news about a super cycle in commodities and possibly in semiconductors. So before we go, just tell us a little bit about how a super cycle might fit into the memory chip picture.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I believe in the super cycle myself, but the idea is that there is a cycle. Upward portion lasts somewhere between 18 to 2 years. The downward side lasts about 6 months, and it basically says that on the upward cycle, all the semiconductor buyers are buying semiconductors because they want to invest. They want to modernize. They want to increase the size of their the IT infrastructure, for example, server farms. And the super cycle may have been started this time around earlier, perhaps because of the coronavirus. We saw a large increase in demand for semiconductors last year because of the coronavirus, everybody working from home and everybody watching streaming services on their TVs. So they had to expand their server capacity. And now they're going to expand that even further, partially because the coronavirus is expected to continue this, distancing is expected to continue this year, and partially because the interest rate is still so cheap that the IT companies are borrowing to invest in large extension of their infrastructure. So a lot of people believe that because the super cycle was supposed to start this year anyway, but started a bit earlier last year, but it's on schedule to have additional increases this year. And at least so far, that seems to be coming true because the prices of semiconductors are rising fairly quickly. And for certain types of semiconductors, there seems to be very much a excess demand.
All right, Professor, we appreciate your explanation. We'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for your insights, as always.
Thank you.
South Korea is going to start administering the vaccine developed by AstraZeneca to people 65 and older starting tomorrow. The vaccination committee on Monday said it found the vaccine is safe, and President Moon is urging people to get it when it's their turn. Kim Hyun-sung reports.
South Korea will continue with AstraZeneca inoculations amid rising concerns over the vaccine's safety. The government's decision is backed by the Korea Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which reiterates that the vaccine is safe. The AstraZeneca vaccine is an effective and safe vaccine that has reduced severe infections and deaths caused by COVID-19 in clinical trials and at actual medical centers. The benefits of being vaccinated outweigh the risk of side effects. The committee also said that cases of blood clots and cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, also known as CVST, are extremely rare after receiving the vaccines. So far, there have been 7 reports of blood clots and 18 cases of CVST out of 20 million inoculated in the UK and Europe. Experts also examined the link between other symptoms and the vaccines and found 2 cases that have been proven to be causally linked. 1 out of the 10 cases that showed clinical symptoms similar to anaphylaxis within 10 minutes of vaccination, and another case that showed high fever, muscle convulsion, and low blood pressure the day or the following day showed causality with the vaccines. President Moon Jae-in also reaffirmed that the public should not be concerned.
국민들께서도 백신의 안전성에 조금 더 의심을 품지 마시고 접종 순서가 되는 대로 접종에 응해 주시기 바랍니다.
From Tuesday, South Korea will start inoculations for those aged 65 and over, with some 377,000 people eligible. This includes the president and the first lady, aged 68 and 66 years old respectively, who will get their doses on the same day. Inoculations will start from care hospitals and move on to nursing homes on March 30th. To date, some 650,000 people in South Korea have received their first doses, 90% of which were the AstraZeneca vaccines. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
In other news, North Korea has officially closed its embassy in Malaysia after ties broke down over Malaysia's decision to extradite a North Korean man to the U.S. on money laundering charges. Malaysia had already closed its own embassy in the north after the murder of Kim Jong-un's brother at the Kuala Lumpur airport back in 2017, an operation believed to have been orchestrated by Pyongyang. Kim Da-mi reports.
North Korean diplomats and their families vacated the North's embassy in Malaysia on Sunday, just 2 days after the two countries announced the end of their ties. Before heading to the airport for their flights to Shanghai, a North Korean official insisted that the incident was the result of an anti-Pyongyang conspiracy laid out by Washington.
This incident is an out-and-out product of anti-PRK conspiracy created from the heinous policy of the hostility by the United States at isolating and suffocating our country and the pro-U.S. subservience by the Malaysian authority.
Observers point out that the North's warning against Washington shows that it sees the case as an extension of the U.S. hostile policies against the regime.
Relating the situation with its structure and dignity, the North also believes Washington will increase its pressure against Pyongyang. The North is going for that an eye move.
The dramatic severance of ties comes in protest of Malaysia's court ruling earlier this month to extradite a North Korean businessman to the U.S. on money laundering charges. In response to Pyongyang's decision to cut ties, Malaysia ordered North Korean officials to leave the country within 48 hours. Meanwhile, according to the Associated Press, the North Korean man who the extradition order relates to, Moon Chul-myung, was taken into FBI custody on Saturday. This makes him the first North Korean to be extradited to the U.S. While Malaysia claims its extradition had been done according to law, Moon has argued that the arrest was politically motivated. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Americans continue to mourn the victims of last week's mass shooting in Atlanta, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. Many are calling for the suspect to face hate crime charges, though he has reportedly made no indication that he was motivated by race. Georgia's hate crime law is less than a year old and is yet to be tested. A federal hate crime charge could bring a life sentence. Kim Do-yeon has the details.
Sparked by the shooting spree last week in Atlanta, the U.S. saw mass gatherings in the streets calling for an end to anti-Asian racism. Specifically, the protesters demanded that the suspect in the Atlanta shootings be charged with a hate crime.
What the guy did in Atlanta, that was not sexual. He was targeting Asians. He didn't go next door and attack the other spas.
Robert Long has been charged with 8 counts of homicide and 1 count of aggravated assault over the Atlanta shootings. The suspect has said he has a sex addiction, which motivated his actions. Apart from his admissions, the authorities have to rely on written or other proof, and investigators still haven't found enough evidence to call it a hate crime against Asians. In Georgia, defendants convicted of a felony would face at least an extra 2 years in prison if it is proven that they intentionally selected any victim or group of victims out of bigotry. The hate crime law in Georgia was only signed last year and is yet to be tested. In addition, if the FBI finds the case to be a hate crime, the Department of Justice can intervene and charge a suspect under federal law, which could bring with it a life sentence. Even if not classed as a hate crime, 8 counts of homicide would generally result in a prison term far longer than one's life expectancy, and local media have reported that the crime meets the threshold for the death penalty. Classing the case as a hate crime will therefore not make much difference to the severity of any sentence, but it could bring symbolic for many reasons, including helping make Asian Americans feeling protected by the legal system. In the U.S., hate crimes against Asian Americans rose by 149% in 2020 in 16 major cities compared with 2019, according to the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. Apart from race, legal experts in Georgia also said that as the new hate crime law includes attack on gender, and as the suspect has admitted that the shootings came from his sex addiction, this could also be used to include the charge of hate crimes. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Japan's decision over the weekend not to let international spectators enter the country for this summer's Olympics is projected to cost Japan's economy well over $1 billion in what would have been ticket sales, hotel bookings, and other tourist money. Choi Min-jung reports.
Japan is set to face an economic loss of more than $1 billion following its inevitable decision to ban foreign spectators from the Tokyo Olympics this summer. Citing an economist, Japan's public broadcaster NHK on Saturday reported that the absence of international spectators would lead to a loss of up to $1.38 billion. This is mainly due to the refunds that will be given to more than 600,000 overseas residents who have already purchased tickets, as well as some 300,000 people who bought tickets for the Paralympics. The estimate also takes into consideration the economic damage to the country's hospitality and tourism sector, as it can no longer welcome foreign tourists. The scaled-down Olympic means that the government will not be getting the economic boost it had long been hoping for. Earlier on Saturday, the Tokyo 2020 Organizing Committee announced that overseas spectators will be banned from watching the games in person. The statement said the COVID-19 situation remains very challenging in Japan and around the world, and the decision was unavoidable given the health risks.
It is truly disappointing, but given the COVID-19 situation and in order not to burden the medical situation in Japan, it was an unavoidable decision in order to ensure a safe and secure environment for people in Japan and the athletes and participants coming from abroad.
Regarding local spectators, the committee will meet again next month to decide on letting local fans attend the events in person. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.
Korea rolled out its COVID-19 vaccination campaign on February 26.